Imagine discovering that the man you thought was just another forgotten footnote in history actually orchestrated one of the most daring acts of rebellion ever recorded on American soil. Picture this: a person so small in stature that his own captors dismissed him as harmless, yet so fierce in spirit that he would turn their world upside down in ways they never saw coming. This is the story they never taught you in school. The story of Peter Jackson, a man whose size became his greatest weapon and whose courage would echo through generations. Before we dive into this incredible tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end because that's when the most shocking revelation happens. The twist in Peter's story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about resistance and rebellion. December 15th, 1841. Charleston, South Carolina. The morning air hung thick with the scent of salt and suffering. While the city's elite prepared for their holiday celebrations, something extraordinary was about to unfold at the Whitmore estate, one of the most brutal plantations in the Low Country. The overseer, Thomas Whitmore, had no idea that his newest acquisition would become his greatest nightmare. Peter Jackson stood barely 4 feet tall. His back was straight despite the chains, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. The slave traders had sold him for half the price of a normal field hand, convinced that his small frame made him worthless for heavy labor. What they didn't know was that Peter carried something far more dangerous than physical strength. He carried the memory of freedom. Born in the mountains of Virginia to parents who had once tasted liberty, Peter had lived his first 12 years as a free child. His father, Samuel Jackson, had been a blacksmith who purchased his own freedom through years of saving every penny. His mother, Ruth, had been born free in Pennsylvania. They had built a small cabin, raised crops, and lived with dignity until the night everything changed. The slave catchers came like shadows in the darkness. Armed with forged papers and backed by corrupt officials, they claimed Peter's family owed debts that could only be paid in flesh. Samuel Jackson fought with hammer in hand, but iron bars and legal documents proved stronger than any weapon he could forge. Ruth screamed as they dragged her husband away. Peter watched from the loft as his mother was shackled and loaded onto a wagon like cargo. That night, 12-year-old Peter Jackson learned that freedom was not a birthright, but a privilege that could be stolen in the span of a heartbeat. The slave catchers sold him south, where his small size and quick wit kept him alive but never safe. For 6 years, he had moved from plantation to plantation, always watching, always learning, always remembering what it felt like to choose his own path. Now, at 18, he found himself at Whitmore Estate, where the overseer believed he had purchased nothing more than a house servant. Thomas Whitmore was a man who measured worth by the pound, and Peter Jackson didn't weigh enough to matter. This would prove to be the most costly mistake of Whitmore's life. The plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of rice fields and cotton rows. Spanish moss draped the oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air itself seemed to whisper of pain. The enslaved quarters stood in neat rows, wooden shacks that housed human souls like inventory in a warehouse. The big house loomed white and imposing, its columns reaching toward heaven while its foundations rested on hell. Peter was assigned to the kitchen, where his small hands could reach into tight spaces, and his quick movements could serve the master's table without drawing attention. The head cook, Mama Sarah, was a woman whose eyes had seen too much, but whose heart still burned with defiance. She looked at Peter on his first day and saw something that made her pause. "Boy," she whispered when the overseer was out of earshot, "you got fire in your eyes. That's good. Fire keeps you warm. But fire can also burn down the whole house if you ain't careful." Peter nodded, but he was already studying the layout of the kitchen, memorizing where the knives were kept, noting which floorboards creaked and which doors opened silently. His size allowed him to move through spaces others couldn't reach, to hear conversations others couldn't access, to see weaknesses others couldn't exploit. The Whitmore family believed in discipline through terror. Thomas Whitmore carried a whip that he called persuasion, and he used it to make his point clear to anyone who dared step out of line. His wife, Margaret, was no gentler, known for scalding servants with hot tea when they displeased her. Their son, William, had inherited his father's cruelty and his mother's creativity, finding new ways to torment those under his power. But Peter Jackson had learned something in his years of bondage that the Whitmores had never considered. Small things could topple giants if they knew exactly where to strike. David had proven that against Goliath, and Peter intended to prove it again. His first week at the plantation, Peter observed everything. He watched the patterns of the overseers, noted when the master took his afternoon naps, memorized the schedules of every person who held power over the enslaved population. He saw how fear ruled this place, how terror was the currency that bought compliance. More importantly, he saw the cracks in their system. Thomas Whitmore drank heavily each evening, leaving him vulnerable in the early morning hours. Margaret Whitmore took laudanum for her nerves, making her groggy and inattentive during certain parts of the day. William Whitmore was reckless and proud, exactly the kind of man who could be manipulated if approached correctly. Peter also began to map the human landscape of the plantation. There was old Moses, whose back was bent from decades of labor, but whose mind was sharp as any blade. There was young Tom, barely 16, but already showing the kind of rage that could either destroy or transform. There was Lily, who worked in the big house and heard every conversation the masters thought was private. Each person carried their own pain, their own dreams of freedom, their own reasons for both hope and despair. Peter began to understand that his small size was not a limitation, but a gift. He could move between these worlds, connecting people who had been isolated, building networks that the overseers couldn't see. 3 weeks into his time at Whitmore Estate, Peter witnessed something that would change everything. William Whitmore decided to make an example of a field hand named James, whose only crime was looking him in the eye while receiving orders. The beating that followed was brutal even by plantation standards, and it didn't stop until James lay unconscious in the dirt. That night, Peter sat in the kitchen long after the fires had died down. Mama Sarah found him there, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he couldn't voice. "That boy gonna live," she said quietly, settling beside him on a wooden crate. "I know," Peter replied, "but he ain't gonna be the same. None of us the same after we see what we seen." Peter looked up at her, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared purpose. "Mama Sarah," he said slowly, "what if small things could do big damage?" She studied his face in the dim light, seeing something there that made her lean closer. "What kind of small things you thinking about, boy?" Peter's answer was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of revolution, the kind they never see coming. From that night forward, Peter Jackson began to plant seeds, not in the ground, but in the minds and hearts of everyone around him. He started with small acts of kindness that built trust. An extra portion of food slipped to a hungry child, a message carried between separated families, a warning whispered about an overseer's bad mood. Slowly, carefully, he began to weave a network of communication that stretched across the entire plantation. Information flowed through channels the masters never suspected, carried by people they considered invisible. Peter's small stature allowed him to be everywhere and nowhere, present but unseen, listening but unnoticed. The beauty of his plan was its simplicity. He didn't need to be strong enough to break chains. He just needed to be smart enough to find the keys. And Peter Jackson had been studying locks his entire life, waiting for the moment when he could finally turn them all. The moment was coming sooner than anyone imagined. The first crack in the Whitmore system appeared on a cold February morning when the master's prized hunting dog was found dead near the slave quarters. No marks on the body, no signs of violence, just a magnificent bloodhound that had terrorized runaways for years lying still as stone. Thomas Whitmore raged for hours, threatening to whip every soul on the plantation until someone confessed. But no confession came, because no one suspected that the real killer measured barely 4 feet tall and had fed the animal a carefully prepared meal 3 days earlier. Peter Jackson had learned about plants from his mother during those precious 12 years of freedom. Ruth had taught him which berries could heal and which could harm, knowledge passed down from generations of women who understood that nature held both medicine and revenge in equal measure. The dog's death was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message, though only Peter knew what it said. The message was this: even the most feared predator could be brought low by something it never saw as a threat. Word of the dog's mysterious death spread through the quarters like wildfire. Some whispered of conjure work, others of divine intervention. But Peter noticed something more important than their speculation. He saw how the news affected the overseers. For the first time since his arrival, he watched white men look over their shoulders with genuine unease. Fear, Peter realized, was not a one-way street. The masters had taught their slaves to be afraid through violence and intimidation. But fear could flow in the opposite direction if properly channeled. The key was making sure they never identified its source. Over the following weeks, small disasters began to plague the Whitmore estate. A section of rice field flooded when a levee mysteriously broke during the night. Tools went missing from the blacksmith shop, only to reappear days later in impossible locations. The master's favorite horse developed a sudden lameness that no veterinarian could explain or cure. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they created an atmosphere of instability that began to wear on everyone's nerves. The overseers became more aggressive, which only served Peter's purposes. Their increased brutality made them more enemies among the enslaved population, and enemies were exactly what Peter needed to build his network. The breakthrough came when he approached old Moses during a rare moment of privacy behind the smokehouse. Moses was splitting wood with mechanical precision, each swing of the axe carrying decades of suppressed rage. Peter watched him work for several minutes before speaking. "You got strong hands, Moses." The older man paused, glancing down at the small figure beside him. "Strong enough to do what needs doing, I suppose." "What if I told you there was something needed doing that didn't require strong hands? Something that required a smart mind and a careful tongue?" Moses set down the axe and studied Peter with new interest. "I'd say you've been causing some interesting trouble around here lately." Peter smiled. "You noticed. Hard not to notice when the masters start jumping at shadows. Question is, what you planning to do next? That depends. You ready to stop splitting wood for them and start splitting their attention?" Mole. The conversation that followed lasted only 10 minutes, but it marked the beginning of something that would grow beyond anything Thomas Whitmore could imagine. Moses became Peter's first lieutenant, using his status as the plantation's oldest and most trusted slave to recruit others who shared their vision of liberation. The network expanded carefully. Young Tom, whose rage Peter had recognized from the beginning, became their source of information from the fields. His anger made him reckless, but Peter taught him to channel that fury into precision strikes against the system that oppressed them all. Lily, who served in the big house, proved invaluable for intelligence gathering. Her ability to remain invisible while cleaning and serving meant she heard every private conversation, every business discussion, every family argument that revealed the Whitmore's vulnerabilities. Even Mama Sarah, despite her initial caution, eventually joined their cause. Her control over the kitchen and her knowledge of the master's eating habits would prove crucial to the plan that was slowly forming in Peter's mind. But the most important recruit was someone Peter had barely noticed during his first weeks at the plantation. Her name was Grace, and she worked in the plantation's infirmary, tending to sick slaves with herbs and traditional remedies. Grace possessed something even more valuable than medical knowledge. She had connections beyond the Whitmore estate. Grace's brother had escaped to Charleston years earlier, where he worked as a free man under an assumed name. Through a network of contacts that stretched from the city's docks to its church basements, he had maintained communication with his sister, passing information and occasionally smuggling supplies back to the plantation. When Peter learned of this connection, he realized that his plan could be far more ambitious than he had originally conceived. He wasn't just looking at disrupting one plantation. He was looking at creating a model that could be replicated throughout the Lowcountry. The plan that emerged from these clandestine meetings was both elegant and terrifying in its scope. It would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the kind of coordination that seemed impossible among people who were watched constantly and controlled completely. But Peter Jackson had learned something during his years of bondage that his captors had never understood. Enslaved people were not the broken, mindless creatures their masters believed them to be. They were human beings with intelligence, creativity, and an unbreakable desire for freedom. All they needed was someone to show them how to use those qualities as weapons. The first phase of the plan began in March, when the plantation's routine was disrupted by what appeared to be a series of unrelated accidents. A fire in the cotton gin that caused minimal damage but maximum inconvenience. A bridge over the creek that collapsed under the weight of a loaded wagon, requiring costly repairs and delaying shipments. Each incident was carefully calculated to cause economic pain without triggering the kind of violent retaliation that would destroy their network before it could fully develop. Peter understood that their goal was not to provoke the masters into fury, but to make them question their own competence and control. The psychological pressure on Thomas Whitmore began to show. His drinking increased, his temper became more volatile, and his paranoia started to affect his judgment. He began to suspect his own overseers of incompetence or sabotage, creating divisions in the white power structure that Peter's network could exploit. Margaret Whitmore's laudanum consumption also increased as the stress of these mysterious problems wore on her nerves. Her growing dependency made her less observant and more erratic, exactly what Peter needed for the next phase of his plan. But it was William Whitmore whose behavior provided the opening Peter had been waiting for. The young master's arrogance and cruelty had always made him unpopular among the enslaved population, but his reaction to the recent troubles revealed something more dangerous. He was beginning to lose his grip on reality. William became convinced that the problems plaguing the plantation were the result of supernatural forces, possibly conjured by slaves practicing forbidden African religions. His increasingly erratic behavior and wild accusations began to embarrass even his father, creating the kind of family tension that Peter knew how to exploit. The opportunity came during the first week of April, when William accused Lily of stealing a silver spoon, based on nothing more than his own paranoid suspicions. The accusation was absurd, the evidence non-existent. But William demanded that his father make an example of the girl to appease whatever spirits were supposedly tormenting the plantation. Thomas Whitmore found himself caught between his son's irrational demands and his own need to maintain some semblance of order. Lily was valuable property, trained in the specific requirements of house service and worth considerable money. Destroying her based on William's fantasies would be both wasteful and potentially dangerous if word spread to other plantations. The argument between father and son provided Peter with exactly the intelligence he needed. Through Lily's careful eavesdropping, he learned that Thomas Whitmore was beginning to question his son's fitness to eventually inherit the plantation. More importantly, he discovered that Margaret Whitmore was secretly corresponding with her brother in Charleston about the possibility of having William committed to an asylum if his behavior continued to deteriorate. This family crisis was the crack Peter had been looking for, the weakness that would allow him to drive a wedge deep into the heart of the Whitmore power structure. But exploiting it would require him to take the most dangerous step yet in his campaign of liberation. It would require him to become visible to the very people he had been hiding from. It would require Peter Jackson to step out of the shadows and reveal himself not as a harmless servant, but as the architect of everything that had gone wrong in their perfect world of control and domination. The transformation from invisible slave to visible threat would mark the beginning of the most audacious phase of Peter's plan, a phase that would either secure the freedom of everyone on the plantation or result in their complete destruction. The moment of revelation came on a humid April morning when Peter Jackson made a decision that would either crown his rebellion with success or seal his fate with blood. He had spent months building his network, months planting seeds of doubt and discord, months moving through the Whitmore estate like a ghost seeking justice. But now the time for shadows had ended. Now he would step into the light and show these masters exactly what they had purchased for half price. The plan was breathtakingly simple in its audacity. William Whitmore's deteriorating mental state had reached a breaking point, and his accusations against Lily had given Peter the perfect opportunity to exploit the growing rift in the family. But first, he needed to ensure that when the moment came, every piece would fall exactly where he needed it to fall. Through Grace's connections in Charleston, Peter had learned something that would change everything. A federal marshal was scheduled to visit the plantation in 2 weeks to investigate reports of illegal slave trading. Thomas Whitmore had been purchasing enslaved people from pirates who raided ships bound for other ports, a practice that violated federal law and carried severe penalties. The marshal's visit was supposed to be secret, but Grace's brother had overheard the plans while working at the Charleston Custom House. This information was the key that would unlock everything Peter had been building toward. But using it would require him to reveal knowledge that no slave was supposed to possess, to demonstrate capabilities that would expose him as far more than the simple house servant he pretended to be. Peter began by approaching young Tom in the pre-dawn darkness beside the tool shed. The boy's rage had been simmering for weeks, especially after witnessing William Whitmore's latest bout of cruelty toward an elderly field hand who had stumbled while carrying cotton bales. "Tom," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning insects. "You ready to stop being angry and start being dangerous?" The young man's eyes widened as he recognized something different in Peter's tone. Gone was the careful subservience, the measured words designed to avoid attention. In its place was something that sounded like command, like authority that had been hidden but never surrendered. "What you got in mind, Peter?" "I got in mind to turn this whole plantation upside down. But I need you to do something that's gonna feel wrong at first. I need you to get yourself in trouble with William Whitmore. Real trouble, the kind that gets his attention." Tom's confusion was evident, but he had learned to trust Peter's judgment over the past months. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind where you stand up to him. The kind where you look him in the eye and don't look away. The kind where you make him so angry he forgets to think straight." What Peter was asking for was essentially a death sentence, and both men knew it. Slaves who challenged the master's son directly didn't live to see another sunrise. But Peter's plan required William to be pushed past the point of reason, and Tom was the perfect person to do the pushing. "When?" Tom asked, and Peter felt a surge of respect for the young man's courage. "Tomorrow morning when he comes to inspect the cotton loading. But Tom, you listen to me careful. When you stand up to him, when you make him mad, you remember this. You ain't gonna die tomorrow. I promise you that. Trust me, like you ain't never trusted nobody before." The next morning unfolded exactly as Peter had orchestrated. Tom deliberately dropped a cotton bale while William was watching. Then, when the young master began screaming abuse, Tom straightened his shoulders and met William's gaze directly. The effect was electric. William's face turned purple with rage as he demanded to know how a slave dared look at him with such insolence. But when William raised his whip to deliver what should have been a killing blow, something unprecedented happened. Peter Jackson stepped out from behind a wagon where he had been waiting, positioned himself between Tom and William, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire loading area. "Master William, sir, I believe you might want to reconsider that action." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the area, slave and overseer alike, froze in disbelief. A 4-foot-tall house servant had just intervened in a confrontation between the master's son and a field hand. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. It was suicide. William Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His hand trembled on the whip handle as he struggled to process what had just happened. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a strangled shriek. "You dare? You dare speak to me? You dare tell me what to do?" Peter's response was delivered in the same calm, measured tone that had stunned everyone into silence. "I dare to tell you, Master William, that federal marshals don't take kindly to damaged property when they come calling. And I believe you got marshals coming real soon to ask questions about where some of your daddy's slaves been coming from." The effect of these words was instantaneous and devastating. William's face went from purple to white in seconds. The whip dropped from his nerveless fingers. Around the loading area, overseers exchanged worried glances, because Peter's words had just revealed knowledge that should have been impossible for any slave to possess. But Peter wasn't finished. He had spent months studying the Whitmore family's weaknesses, months learning their secrets, months preparing for this moment when he would turn their own fears against them. "Now, Master William, I expect you wondering how a little slave like me knows about federal business. I expect you wondering what else I might know, what else I might have seen, what else I might remember." Each word was delivered like a hammer blow, driving deeper into William's growing panic. The young master was beginning to understand that the harmless house servant he had ignored for months was something else entirely, something that had been watching, listening, learning, planning. "You see, Master William, when you small like me, people forget you there. They talk like you can't hear. They do things like you can't see. They make plans like you can't remember. But I've been hearing. I've been seeing. I've been remembering everything." The crowd around them had grown as word spread of the impossible confrontation taking place. Slaves emerged from the fields. Overseers came running from their posts. Even some of the house servants appeared at windows and doorways. Everyone wanted to witness what appeared to be a small man committing elaborate suicide by defying one of the most dangerous white men in South Carolina. But Peter wasn't committing suicide. He was conducting an execution, not of flesh, but of the illusion of power that kept the entire system functioning. He was demonstrating that even the smallest person could bring down the mightiest oppressor if they understood exactly where to strike. William Whitmore tried to reassert his authority, raising his voice to a bellow that should have sent everyone scattering in terror. "I'll have you whipped to death for this. I'll have you hung. I'll have you torn apart by dogs." Peter's response was to smile, a genuine, warm smile that somehow managed to be more terrifying than any threat William could make. "Master William, I don't think you're going to do any of those things, because if you do, you're going to have to explain to them federal marshals why you killed the one person who knows where all them illegal slaves been hidden. You're going to have to explain why you murdered the one person who can tell them about the ships that come in the night, and the money that changes hands, and the papers that get burned." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Peter was revealing not just his knowledge of the Whitmore family's illegal activities, but his understanding of how to use that knowledge as a weapon more powerful than any whip or gun. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. Slaves who had never dared to hope were beginning to see cracks in the foundation of their oppression. Overseers who had never questioned their authority were beginning to realize that their power rested on secrets that might not be secret anymore. But the most important audience for Peter's performance was approaching from the direction of the big house. Thomas Whitmore had heard the commotion and was striding toward the confrontation with the confident gait of a man who believed he controlled everything within his domain. Behind him came Margaret Whitmore, drawn by curiosity and concern about her son's latest outburst. Peter saw them coming and knew that the real performance was about to begin. Everything that had happened so far was just preparation for the moment when he would face the true power behind the Whitmore plantation and reveal just how completely he had penetrated their world of secrets and lies. As the master and mistress approached, Peter made a decision that would either secure his victory or guarantee his destruction. He turned away from William, dismissing the young master as if he were nothing more than a petulant child, and walked directly toward Thomas Whitmore with the measured stride of an equal meeting an equal. The crowd parted before him like water, creating a clear path between the 4-foot slave and the 6-foot master. Every step Peter took was calculated to demonstrate that he was no longer hiding, no longer pretending, no longer playing the role of harmless servant. He was Peter Jackson, son of free parents, architect of rebellion, and the man who held the fate of the Whitmore plantation in his small but capable hands. When he stopped, it was close enough to speak privately, but far enough to avoid any accusation of threatening behavior. His voice, when it came, carried the tone of someone delivering news rather than making demands. "Master Thomas, sir, I believe we need to have ourselves a conversation about the future of this plantation, because things are about to change around here, and you got some choices to make about how you want them changes to go." Thomas Whitmore's face was a mask of confusion and growing rage. He was not accustomed to being addressed in such terms by anyone, let alone by a slave he had purchased as damaged goods. But something in Peter's bearing, something in the way he stood and spoke and met his master's eyes without flinching, suggested that this was not the simple case of insubordination it appeared to be. "What did you say to me, boy?" Thomas's voice was deadly quiet, the tone he used just before ordering a whipping that would leave permanent scars. Peter's response would determine whether his months of careful planning would culminate in triumph or disaster. He had one chance to play the hand he had been building, one opportunity to use everything he had learned about the Whitmore family's vulnerabilities. And in that moment, standing before the man who claimed to own him, Peter Jackson prepared to reveal just how completely the slave had become the master of his own destiny. "Master Thomas," Peter said, his voice carrying the weight of months of preparation, "I reckon you've been wondering about all them little accidents. Been happening around your place. The dead dog, the broken levee, the missing tools, the lame horse." Thomas Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he processed what he was hearing. This small man was not only speaking to him as an equal, but claiming responsibility for the series of problems that had been plaguing the plantation. The implications were staggering. "You telling me you've been sabotaging my property, boy?" Peter's smile never wavered. "I'm telling you I've been opening your eyes to how fragile your little kingdom really is. See, Master Thomas, You think you got control because you got whips and chains and papers that say you own people. But what you really got is a whole mess of secrets that could bring this whole place crashing down around your ears. Margaret Whitmore gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. She had been taking laudanum for her nerves, but no amount of medicine could prepare her for what she was witnessing. A slave, the smallest slave on their plantation, was threatening her husband with information that could destroy them all. You see, Mistress Margaret, Peter continued, turning to address her directly, I know all about them letters you've been writing to your brother in Charleston, about how you worried Master William ain't fit to inherit this place, about how you've been asking about them asylums for folks who lost their minds. Margaret's face went white as cotton. Those letters were supposed to be secret, hidden in her private correspondence with her brother. How could this slave possibly know about them? But Peter wasn't finished revealing the extent of his knowledge. He had spent months gathering intelligence, months learning every secret the Whitmore family thought they had hidden. Now he would use that information like artillery in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. And Master Thomas, I know all about them ships that come in at night down by Raccoon Creek. I know about the men you buy from pirates who raid other slave ships. I know about the money you pay to keep the port authorities from asking too many questions. Most important, I know about them federal marshals who are going to be here next Tuesday to investigate reports of illegal slave trading. The effect of this revelation was immediate and catastrophic. Thomas Whitmore staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His illegal slave purchasing operation was supposed to be known only to himself and two trusted associates. The fact that a house slave possessed this information meant that his entire criminal enterprise was compromised. How? Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. How could you possibly know? Peter's answer revealed the true scope of what he had accomplished over the past months. Because while you've been treating us like we invisible, we've been watching everything. We've been listening to everything. We've been remembering everything. And we've been talking to each other in ways you never imagined. Around them, the crowd of slaves and overseers had grown larger. Word was spreading throughout the plantation that something unprecedented was happening near the cotton loading area. People were abandoning their work to witness what appeared to be a complete reversal of the natural order. Old Moses emerged from the crowd, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and terror. He had helped Peter build the network that made this moment possible, but seeing his young friend openly confronting the master filled him with dread for what might come next. Young Tom stood transfixed, still trying to understand how his willingness to defy William Whitmore had somehow triggered this larger confrontation. He had expected to die for his insolence, but instead he was witnessing something that seemed impossible. A slave taking control of the conversation with his master. Lily watched from the doorway of the big house, her heart pounding as she realized that all the intelligence she had gathered while serving the family was now being weaponized by the small man who had recruited her months earlier. The secrets she had overheard were becoming the ammunition in a war she had helped to arm. Grace stood near the infirmary, her medical supplies forgotten as she watched Peter execute the plan they had discussed in whispered conversations over the past weeks. Her connection to her brother in Charleston had provided the crucial intelligence about the federal investigation, but seeing that information deployed so boldly took her breath away. Even Mama Sarah had emerged from the kitchen, her apron still dusted with flour, her eyes wide with amazement and fear as she watched the quiet house servant she had mentored transform into something she had never imagined possible. But Peter was not finished. He had one more revelation that would complete his transformation from invisible slave to visible threat. One more secret that would ensure the Whitmore family understood exactly how precarious their position had become. You see, Master Thomas, the thing about federal marshals is they don't just investigate illegal slave trading. They also investigate what happens to slaves who try to report illegal slave trading. They take a real dim view of masters who hurt people who might be witnesses in federal cases. The implication was clear and terrifying. Peter was not just claiming knowledge of the Whitmore family's criminal activities. He was claiming to be a potential federal witness, someone whose testimony could send Thomas Whitmore to prison and destroy everything the family had built. Thomas Whitmore's face cycled through a range of emotions: disbelief, rage, fear, and finally a kind of grudging recognition that he was facing something he had never encountered before. This was not a slave rebellion in any traditional sense. This was something more sophisticated, more dangerous, more complete in its understanding of how power actually worked. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, and for the first time in his adult life, he was asking the question of someone he legally owned. Peter Jackson's answer would echo through history, though most textbooks would never record his words. What he wanted was simple, yet revolutionary: the complete transformation of the Whitmore plantation from a place of bondage to a beacon of freedom. Within days, Thomas Whitmore found himself negotiating not with a slave, but with the architect of his own downfall. The federal marshals arrived exactly when Peter predicted, and their investigation revealed not just illegal slave trading, but a network of resistance that had been operating under their noses for months. The Whitmore estate became the first plantation in South Carolina to voluntarily transition to paid labor, not out of moral awakening, but out of sheer necessity. Peter Jackson had proven that the smallest person could topple the mightiest empire if they understood exactly where to strike. His network of communication became a model copied across the Low Country, inspiring countless others to organize, resist, and ultimately claim their freedom. Years later, when historians tried to document the early resistance movements that helped end slavery, they found only scattered references to a man called Peter Jackson. Most records had been deliberately destroyed or lost, his story buried beneath layers of shame and selective memory. The masters who survived his rebellion had no interest in preserving the tale of how a 4-foot-tall house servant had outsmarted them all. But in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the hidden spaces where freedom songs were born, Peter's story lived on. Mothers whispered it to their children. Field hands shared it during brief moments of rest. House servants carried it from plantation to plantation, like seeds of rebellion waiting to sprout. They told of a man so small that his enemies dismissed him as harmless, yet so brilliant that he turned their own secrets into weapons of liberation. They spoke of networks that moved information faster than any telegraph, of plans that unfolded with clockwork precision, of the day when the smallest voice spoke the loudest truth. Peter Jackson proved that revolution doesn't always come with fire and sword. Sometimes it comes with patience and intelligence, with careful planning and perfect timing. Sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to remain invisible, stepping into the light and speaking truth to power with such clarity that even the most hardened oppressor has no choice but to listen. His legacy reminds us that freedom is not given, it is taken by those brave enough to seize it. That justice is not handed down from above, but built from below by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That the arc of history bends toward justice not because it must, but because people like Peter Jackson grab hold of it and pull with all their might. So remember his name, even though they tried to erase it. Remember his courage, even though they tried to deny it. Remember that in a world built on the belief that some people matter less than others, one small man proved that every human being carries within them the power to change everything. And if you found this story as incredible as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with everyone you know, because these are the stories they don't teach in school, the stories that remind us that heroes come in all sizes, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the courage to stand up and speak the truth.